The diesel engine hummed. It was a comforting sound, a familiar rhythm in the vast emptiness. Jim gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn leather. The heater struggled against the Montana cold. Outside, snow fell in thick swirling sheets. 3 a.m., the witching hour. Most folks were tucked away, warm in their beds. Not Jim. He was hauling freight, pushing through the night on a desolate stretch of highway. The headlights cut through the swirling snow, painting a tunnel of light in the darkness. It was a lonely job, but someone had to do it. The miles ticked by, marked by the rhythmic swoosh of the windshield wipers. Jim sipped his coffee, the lukewarm liquid doing little to chase away the chill that seeped into his bones. He thought about his wife, Sarah, and the kids, tucked away safe and warm back home. He missed them, but duty called, and Jim, a man of his word, always answered. The road stretched before him, a black ribbon disappearing into the swirling white. There was beauty in the desolation, a stark, unforgiving kind of beauty. But tonight, it was the loneliness that pressed down on Jim, heavy as the snow-laden clouds above. He rounded a bend, the truck's headlights momentarily blinded by the swirling snow. That's when he saw him. A figure standing in the middle of the road. Jim blinked, trying to clear his vision. He wasn't sure his tired eyes were seeing right. But there he was, a man, standing stock still in the middle of the highway. The figure was tall and thin, almost unnaturally so. He wore a dark suit, old-fashioned, like something out of an old photograph. The man's face was obscured by the falling snow in the distance. Jim's blood ran cold. What was someone doing out here in this weather, in the middle of the night? It didn't make sense. The nearest town was a good 100 miles back. No one in their right mind would be out here in this blizzard, let alone standing in the middle of the road. Jim's pulse quickened. This had to be a trick, a hallucination brought on by fatigue and the hypnotic swirl of the snow. He rubbed his eyes, trying to focus. The figure remained, unwavering, a specter in the swirling white. He couldn't believe his eyes. He had to be hallucinating. He had to be. Instinct took over. Jim slammed on the brakes, the air brakes hissing their protest. The truck skidded, tires losing their grip on the slick asphalt. He wrestled with the steering wheel, fighting to regain control of the rig as it jackknifed across the icy road. Fear, sharp and cold, shot through Jim. He was careening out of control, the heavy truck threatening to topple over. He could feel the blood draining from his face. He fought the urge to close his eyes, knowing he couldn't. Not now. Not when he might be seconds from disaster. Finally, with a shuddering halt, the truck came to a stop. Jim sat there for a moment, heart pounding against his ribs, catching his breath. He was all right. He was in one piece. The truck, thankfully, was upright. Relief washed over him, momentarily chasing away the fear. But the image of the man in the road, the reason for this near-death experience, brought the fear flooding back. Who was that? And what in God's name was he doing out here? Jim laid on the horn, the sound echoing through the night. He didn't know if the man could hear him over the roar of the wind and the hammering of his own heart, but he had to do something. He couldn't just sit here. He threw the truck into park and ripped off his seatbelt, his hands shaking. He had to see if the man was okay, even if it meant risking his own neck. It was just the way he was wired. Couldn't leave someone stranded, not even in a blizzard, not even in the middle of nowhere. Jim pulled on his heavy jacket, the one Sarah had insisted he pack, and yanked the door open. The wind hit him like a physical blow, bringing with it a fresh wave of icy snow. He shielded his face with his arm and stepped out onto the highway, the icy wind biting at any exposed skin. The road stretched before him, empty. There was no sign of the man. Jim blinked, his eyes scanning the desolate landscape. The snow fell relentlessly, the wind whipping it into a frenzy. Visibility was next to nothing. It was as if the man had simply vanished into thin air. He stood there for a moment, his breath fogging the air, his mind struggling to grasp what he had seen, or thought he had seen. He listened, straining to hear anything over the howling wind. Silence. Except for the wind and the pounding of his own heart, there was nothing. Jim felt a shiver run down his spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, feeling small and vulnerable in the face of the storm and the vastness of the night. Where could he have gone? There was nowhere to hide out here. No trees, no ditches, nothing but open road and swirling snow. He thought about getting back in his truck, about driving away and forgetting this ever happened. But something stopped him, a nagging feeling that he couldn't just leave. What if the man was hurt? What if he needed help? Jim couldn't live with himself if he turned his back on someone in need. He took a tentative step forward, then another. The snow crunched under his boots, the only sound in the vast silence. He called out, his voice swallowed by the wind. "Hello? Is anyone out there? Can you hear me?" His voice was met with silence. Jim felt a chill run down his spine. This was getting stranger by the second. He scanned the road again, looking for any sign of the man, for any sign of life at all. There was nothing. Just the endless white expanse of the snow-covered highway. He started walking, his boots crunching on the frozen asphalt. He looked for footprints, tire tracks, anything that would indicate the man had been real and not a figment of his sleep-deprived imagination. But the wind had already erased any sign, leaving behind a pristine white canvas. Jim walked further, his unease growing with each step. The wind seemed to bite through his jacket now, chilling him to the bone. He pulled his hat lower over his ears and continued on, his gaze fixed on the ground. He had to find something, anything to prove he wasn't going crazy. He thought about calling for help, but his cell phone was useless out here. No signal, he was on his own. He stopped, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. He felt a surge of fear, raw and primal. He was alone, truly alone. Jim turned, his back to the biting wind. He had to get out of this weather. He had to get back in his truck. He could call for help from there, once he was back in range. He started back, his steps quicker now, a sense of urgency driving him. He reached his truck and fumbled with the door handle, his frozen fingers clumsy. He finally got it open and practically fell into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind him. The warmth inside the cab felt like heaven compared to the Arctic blast outside. He took a moment, collecting himself, trying to calm his racing heart. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He looked out the windshield at the swirling snow. Had he imagined the whole thing? Was the loneliness finally getting to him? He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing. He wasn't sticking around to find out. He started the engine, the diesel roaring to life, a comforting sound in the eerie silence. He put the truck in gear and pulled away, his eyes glued to the road ahead. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He checked his mirrors, half expecting to see the man standing there watching him, but there was nothing. Just the empty road and the swirling snow. Jim drove on, the events of the last few minutes replaying in his mind like a broken record. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease, of something being terribly wrong. He had seen something out there. He knew he had. He tried to rationalize it, to come up with a logical explanation. A trick of the light? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? But deep down, he knew that whatever he had seen, it was real, and it was terrifying. He pressed on, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He wouldn't feel safe until he reached the next town, until he could see the welcoming glow of the diner lights and hear the comforting murmur of human voices. The miles crawled by, each one an eternity. The silence in the cab was broken only by the hum of the engine and the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. But in Jim's mind, the silence was deafening, filled with the echoes of what he had seen, of what he couldn't explain. He finally reached the town just before dawn, the sky turning a soft shade of gray in the east. He pulled into the diner, the familiar neon sign a welcome sight. He walked inside, the smell of coffee and bacon a comforting assault on his senses. He ordered a coffee and sat at the counter, his hands wrapped around the warm mug. He didn't tell anyone about what he had seen. Who would believe him? He figured they'd just chalk it up to truckers' tales, to one too many nights on the road. But he knew the truth. He had seen something out there in the storm, something that defied explanation. Jim finished his coffee and climbed back into his truck. He had a schedule to keep, a delivery to make. He drove on, the rising sun painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. But the beauty of the morning did little to ease the unease that had settled deep in his gut. He never forgot that night, the night he saw the man in the road. It became a part of him, a story he kept locked away in the back of his mind, a chilling reminder of the vastness and mystery of the world that lay beyond the highway.